There's a photograph. You've probably seen it. A firefighter cradling the limp body of a baby girl, her tiny legs dangling, her face turned away from the camera. Her name was Bailey Allman. She was 1 year old. In that image, captured just minutes after 9:02 a.m. on April 19, 1995, you can see the exact moment innocents died in America. But here's what that photograph doesn't show you. It doesn't show you the 15 other babies and toddlers still buried under 9 floors of concrete and steel. It doesn't show you the mothers outside screaming names that will never be answered. It doesn't show you the man who walked away from the truck bomb he'd just armed, checking his watch, making sure he had enough time to escape before 7,000 pounds of explosives turned a daycare center into a mass grave. 168 people went to work that Wednesday morning in Oklahoma City. 168 people who had no idea they had 5 minutes left to live. 19 of them were children. The oldest was 44. The youngest was just 3 months old. The man who killed them didn't wear a mask. He wasn't foreign. He wasn't insane. His name was Timothy James McVeigh, and this is the story of how an ordinary boy became the architect of America's deadliest act of homegrown terrorism. Before we dive deep into his chilling story, hit that like button and subscribe to be part of our growing community. Timothy James McVeigh entered the world on April 23, 1968, in the small industrial town of Lockport, New York, a place of blue-collar grit near the thundering Niagara Falls. He was the middle child in a modest Irish-American family. His dad, William, a steady but quiet factory worker at a General Motors plant, and his mom, Mildred, Mickey as they called her, a travel agent who kept the home running but often seemed distant. With an older sister, Patricia, and a younger one, Jennifer, Tim grew up in a working-class suburb of Pendleton, where life revolved around neighborhood games and the hum of nearby factories. It wasn't poverty that marked his early years, no empty cupboards or desperate streets, but there was a subtle unraveling that started to pull at the threads of his world, threads that would one day snap with devastating consequences. As a little kid, Tim was the neighborhood spark, outgoing, playful, always quick with a joke or a scheme to make a buck. He'd sell packs of gum to classmates for $0.25 apiece, or set up penny pitch games in the basement with old dishes, drawing crowds of kids with his endless energy. Friends remember him as affectionate, the type to hug his godmother during visits and light up family gatherings with his clownish antics. There was warmth in that boy once. Real warmth. The kind that makes you wonder how someone so full of light could become consumed by such darkness. But then at age 10, the family cracked open. His parents' marriage fell apart in a bitter divorce, the kind that left echoes of arguments hanging in the air long after the shouting stopped. Tim blamed his mom for the split and chose to stay with his dad in Pendleton while she moved to Florida with little Jennifer. Weekends meant shuttling between homes, a routine that chipped away at his easy smile, piece by piece, visit by visit. His father's long shifts at the plant left him to fend for himself more often, turning the house into a quiet, lonely place where meals were simple and conversation sparse. School at Starpoint Central became a battleground. Tall and skinny with a shy streak emerging, Tim turned inward as bullies targeted him for his awkwardness. He escaped into daydreams of revenge, imagining himself striking back against the taunts that stung deeper than bruises. No major fights or crimes marked his record yet. But the isolation grew, spreading through his young heart like ice. He found solace in computers, hacking into early systems like a Defense Department network just to prove he could, earning praise for his smarts in a world where he felt invisible. And then there were the guns. His grandfather introduced him to firearms during target practice outings, sparking a fascination that went beyond play. By his teens, Tim was stockpiling books on survivalism and the Second Amendment, reading tales of government overreach that fed a quiet paranoia. What if the feds came for their weapons? The thought lingered like a shadow, growing longer with each passing day. High school graduation in 1986 brought a glimmer of promise, a partial scholarship to a local business college for his sharp mind. But Tim dropped out after a semester, restless and untethered, drifting into odd jobs while the divorce's fallout simmered beneath the surface of his life. Those early bullies, the absent mom, the dad's silent endurance, they didn't make him a monster. Not yet. But they planted seeds of resentment in a boy who craved control, who needed to matter, who would eventually decide that if he couldn't be seen, he would be heard. And the world would have no choice but to listen. In the years leading up to April 19, 1995, Timothy James McVeigh's life spiraled into a cauldron of rage and radicalization that would culminate in the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. The Oklahoma City bombing wasn't a sudden snap. It wasn't a moment of madness or a crime of passion. It was meticulously planned, methodically executed, a descent fueled by a toxic mix of personal grievances and extremist ideologies that had been brewing for years. The Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, a 9-story federal office complex in downtown Oklahoma City, became the target of his fury. And the 168 lives lost, including 19 children whose tiny bodies would be pulled from the wreckage, would bear the tragic weight of his choices. Choices he made with clear eyes and steady hands. McVeigh's path to this crime began to take shape after his honorable discharge from the Army in 1991. He'd been a decorated Gulf War veteran, excelling as a Bradley fighting vehicle gunner, earning a Bronze Star for his precision under pressure. The military life was everything to him: structure, purpose, brotherhood. But it ended abruptly when he washed out of a Special Forces tryout, crushed by the rejection, feeling like a failure for the first time in his military career. He returned to civilian life adrift. Back home, he drifted first to his father's home in Pendleton, New York, then to odd jobs as a security guard and gun show hustler across the country. His resentment grew with each passing day as he watched a government he believed was overreaching, stripping away freedoms, becoming tyrannical. The 1992 Ruby Ridge standoff and the 1993 Waco siege, where federal actions led to civilian deaths, became his obsession. To McVeigh, these weren't tragedies. They were proof, undeniable proof, of a tyrannical state at war with its own people. He devoured the Turner Diaries, a 1978 novel glorifying anti-government violence, including a fictional bombing of a federal building. The book wasn't just a story to him, it was a blueprint, a roadmap to revolution written in blood and fire. By 1993, McVeigh was living a nomadic life, traveling between gun shows and militia circles, connecting with like-minded men like Terry Nichols, an army buddy who shared his distrust of the government. The two bonded over their hatred for federal overreach, swapping ideas about explosives and survivalism at Nichols' farm in Decker, Michigan. They weren't just talking anymore. They were planning. In September 1994, McVeigh's plan crystallized with chilling clarity. He chose the Murrah Building for its symbolic weight, a hub of federal agencies like the ATF and DEA, with a glass front that would maximize destruction. He wanted the world to feel his anger. He wanted them to understand. Over the next 7 months, he and Nichols methodically gathered materials, shopping for death like it was a grocery list. McVeigh scouted the building in December 1994, sketching its layout, taking notes, planning his attack with the precision of a military operation. And he noted the daycare center on the 2nd floor. He saw where the children were. The presence of children didn't deter him. It didn't make him pause or reconsider. He later called them collateral damage, as if their tiny lives were nothing more than acceptable losses in his private war. The timeline tightened in early 1995. McVeigh rented storage units in Kansas under aliases, stockpiling 4,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate fertilizer, a key ingredient for the bomb, purchased from a co-op in McPherson. He mixed it with nitromethane racing fuel acquired in Texas and stole blasting caps from a quarry. Nichols helped assemble the components, but make no mistake, McVeigh was the mastermind, the architect of this atrocity. By April 14, 1995, McVeigh rented a Ryder truck in Junction City, Kansas, using a fake name. Over the next few days in a remote Kansas field, he and Nichols packed the truck's cargo bay with 13 barrels of explosives, 7,000 pounds of destruction wired with dual fuses for reliability. Every connection checked, every detail confirmed. This was his masterpiece. On April 17th, McVeigh checked into the Dreamland Motel in Junction City, alone, his truck parked nearby loaded with death. He spent the next day writing letters, including one to his sister Jennifer, hinting at something big coming, saying goodbye without saying the words. On April 18th, he drove the truck to Oklahoma City, parking it overnight in a lot near the Murrah building, sleeping knowing what dawn would bring. The morning of April 19, 1995, dawned clear and warm. Parents were dropping their children off at daycare. Workers were settling in with their morning coffee. The world was spinning as it always did, ordinary and beautiful and fragile. At 8:57 a.m., McVeigh, wearing a T-shirt with the words, Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus always to tyrants, lit a 5-minute fuse inside the truck, parked it in a drop-off zone directly under the building's daycare center, and walked away without looking back. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated. The explosion sheared off the building's north face, collapsing floors into a smoldering crater. Glass and steel rained down, shredding offices, a social security branch, and the America's Kids daycare, where toddlers were just starting their day, singing songs, playing with blocks, being children. The blast's shockwaves shattered windows for blocks, and the sound echoed like thunder across the city, a sound that would replay in survivors' nightmares for decades. The human toll was staggering. Among the 168 dead were 19 children, including 15 in the daycare, babies like 1-year-old Bailey Allman, whose lifeless body, cradled by a firefighter, became an enduring image of the tragedy, a photograph that captured the world's grief in a single frame. Secretaries like Susan Ferrell, federal workers like Mickey Maroney, and visitors like Charles Porter, a grandfather applying for a Social Security card, perished in an instant. Their morning routines interrupted by violence they never saw coming. Hundreds more were injured, some buried alive under rubble, their screams haunting rescuers for days. The emotional devastation rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. Families shattered, a city stunned, a nation grieving and asking why? Survivors like Dana Bradley, trapped under debris, lost limbs and loved ones, their lives forever scarred by a man they'd never met, a man who decided their suffering was necessary for his cause. What kind of man could walk away from this? What kind of soul could light that fuse and just leave, knowing what was coming? McVeigh didn't linger to witness the chaos he created. After lighting the fuse, he walked calmly to a getaway car, a beat-up yellow Mercury Marquise parked a few blocks away. He drove north out of Oklahoma City, heading toward Kansas on Interstate 35, the smoke rising behind him in his rearview mirror. Just 90 minutes later, at 10:17 a.m., his plan nearly unraveled in the most mundane way possible. Oklahoma State Trooper Charlie Hanger pulled him over near Perry, Oklahoma, 60 miles from the bombing site, for a missing license plate. McVeigh, cool and polite, wore a loaded Glock under his jacket, but Hanger noticed the bulge and arrested him for carrying a concealed weapon. Unaware of any bombing connection, Hanger booked him into the Noble County Jail for what seemed like a routine gun charge. For 2 days, McVeigh sat in a cell watching news reports of the bombing on a jail TV, his expression blank, emotionless, as bodies were pulled from rubble on the screen. He called himself a political prisoner to inmates, hinting at his motives but revealing nothing specific. He watched the children being carried out. He watched the mothers screaming. And he felt nothing. On April 21st, as the FBI traced the Ryder truck's axle to Junction City and linked it to McVeigh's alias, agents descended on the jail. Just hours before his scheduled release on the gun charge, he was transferred to federal custody. The net had closed. Timothy James McVeigh, when first confronted by authorities, didn't offer a detailed alibi to distance himself from the Oklahoma City bombing. Instead, he played it cool, almost eerily detached, as if he'd rehearsed the moment 1,000 times. He told State Trooper Charlie Hanger he was traveling from Arkansas to Kansas, a vague story about visiting friends. When Hanger spotted the concealed Glock under McVeigh's jacket, he was booked on gun charges, not yet linked to the mass murder he'd just committed. In the Noble County Jail, McVeigh stayed silent about the attack, even as news of the 168 deaths flooded the TV mounted in the common area. His initial defense wasn't a formal alibi, but a calculated refusal to engage, hinting he was a political prisoner without admitting guilt. He was playing a game, testing the waters, watching the investigation unfold like it was happening to someone else. The FBI unraveled his non-story swiftly. By April 21, 1995, investigators traced the Ryder truck's axle found in the bombing debris to a rental agency in Junction City, Kansas. Employees identified McVeigh as the man who rented the truck under the alias Robert Kling. Motel records from the Dreamland Motel in Junction City placed him there in the days before the bombing, and a sketch based on witness descriptions matched his face perfectly. Receipts for ammonium nitrate purchases linked to storage units he rented piled up as damning evidence. His fingerprints were found on a fertilizer bag and a cannon fuse. Most chillingly, a business card in his wallet recovered during the arrest had handwritten notes about explosives and the phrase TNT at $5 per stick, need more. His vague travel excuse collapsed under the weight of this forensic trail. He'd been so careful, so methodical, but in the end, he left a trail of breadcrumbs straight back to himself. The trial began on April 24, 1997, in a federal courthouse in Denver, Colorado, moved from Oklahoma to ensure an impartial jury, though how anyone in America could be impartial about such horror seemed impossible. McVeigh faced an 11-count federal indictment, including conspiracy, use of a weapon of mass destruction, and first-degree murder for the deaths of 8 federal employees. Prosecutors, led by Joseph Hartzler, painted McVeigh as a cold-blooded terrorist, driven by anti-government rage, fueled by the Waco siege and Ruby Ridge. They presented a mountain of evidence, 700 witnesses, surveillance footage of the Ryder truck, and chemical residue on McVeigh's clothes matching the bomb's components. The case was airtight. A key moment came when survivor testimony, like that of Dana Bradley, who lost her mother and 2 children in the blast, brought jurors to tears, underscoring the human cost of McVeigh's actions. These weren't statistics. They were people, real people with names and families and futures that had been stolen. The prosecution also introduced letters McVeigh wrote to his sister Jennifer, boasting of something big before the bombing, proving premeditation beyond any doubt. McVeigh's lead attorney, Stephen Jones, didn't deny the bombing happened. He couldn't. Instead, he argued McVeigh wasn't the mastermind, suggesting a broader conspiracy, pointing to John Doe No. 2, a supposed accomplice described by some witnesses but never identified. They claimed the government rushed to pin the crime solely on McVeigh to cover up its own failures at Waco. This theory fizzled quickly, witnesses were inconsistent, and no credible evidence of another bomber emerged. Jones also tried to humanize McVeigh, portraying him as a Gulf War veteran disillusioned by a corrupt government. But this backfired spectacularly, as jurors saw his complete lack of remorse, his cold detachment, his refusal to acknowledge the humanity of his victims. McVeigh himself undermined the defense, privately admitting to his lawyers that he acted alone and saw the bombing as a revolutionary act, a necessary strike against tyranny. He was proud of what he'd done. Proud. The trial's most gripping moment came during closing arguments on May 29, 1997. Prosecutors displayed photos of the 19 children killed, including 1-year-old Bailey Allman, forcing jurors to confront the carnage directly, to look into the eyes of innocence lost. The defense's plea for mercy fell flat against McVeigh's own writings, where he called the children collateral damage, reducing their precious lives to a military term, a cost of war. After 23 hours of deliberation, on June 2, 1997, the jury delivered a unanimous guilty verdict on all 11 counts. The courtroom was silent, the weight of justice palpable in the air. McVeigh showed no emotion, no remorse, no recognition of what he'd done. The sentencing phase began June 4, 1997. Prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, presenting heart-wrenching victim impact statements that tore at the soul. Helena Garrett, whose 16-month-old son Tevin died in the daycare, described cradling his body, a testimony that left jurors sobbing openly in the courtroom. She talked about his laugh, his smile, the way he'd just learned to say mama, and now he was gone. The defense offered mitigating factors, McVeigh's military service, his belief in fighting a tyrannical government, but it rang hollow against the mountains of tiny coffins, the photographs of babies who would never grow up. On June 13, 1997, the jury sentenced McVeigh to death by lethal injection. As the verdict was read, he stared blankly ahead, unbowed, unbroken, as if this was exactly what he expected, what he wanted all along. After his sentencing on June 13, 1997, Timothy James McVeigh was sent to the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana, a maximum security federal prison housing the nation's only federal death row for men. The Special Confinement Unit, a sterile, isolated wing, became his world for the next 4 years, a concrete tomb where he would wait for death. Death row was a place of stark routine and crushing solitude. 23 hours a day in an 8 by 10-foot cell with a concrete bed, a stainless steel sink toilet combo, and a small window offering just a sliver of sky. The fluorescent lights buzzed constantly, and the air carried the faint hum of despair from other inmates. For McVeigh, convicted of the Oklahoma City bombing that killed 168 people, including 19 children, this was both punishment and stage. He would use these years to cement his legacy, to control his narrative one final time. McVeigh's behavior on death row was a mix of defiance and calculation. He spent his days reading voraciously, books on history, politics, and even the Turner Diaries, the extremist novel that had fueled his ideology from the beginning. He wrote letters to supporters, journalists, and his family, carefully crafting his image as a martyr for liberty, a revolutionary willing to die for his cause. To guards, he was polite but distant, never causing trouble but always carrying an air of superiority, as if he were above the system that had condemned him. He befriended a few inmates, including Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, with whom he traded stories of their anti-government crusades during their 1-hour daily recreation in separate outdoor cages. 2 domestic terrorists, comparing notes, validating each other's delusions. McVeigh rejected religion completely, dismissing chaplains' visits with a smirk, calling faith a crutch for the weak. He pursued appeals, but not with the desperation of a man fighting for life. His legal team filed motions challenging the trial's fairness, arguing the media frenzy and the government's rush to judgment had tainted the jury. These efforts dragged on but gained little traction. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. In 2000, a federal appeals court upheld his conviction, and the Supreme Court declined to hear his case. McVeigh seemed almost relieved, later telling his attorneys he was ready to end this, ready to become the martyr he'd always imagined himself to be. The prison environment weighed heavily on everyone. Guards described death row as a place where hope eroded, where inmates paced their cells or shouted to each other through vents just to feel human. McVeigh, though, stayed composed, even joking about his fate. He once told a guard, "I'll be out of here one way or another," as if death was just another door he'd walk through. Yet the isolation took a subtle toll. His letters grew sharper, his tone more bitter as execution loomed. He refused counseling, insisting he had no regrets, no second thoughts, no moments of doubt in the darkness of his cell. The families of his victims, meanwhile, grappled with their grief, some praying for his death, others hoping desperately for a sign of remorse that would never come. On June 11, 2001, the day of his execution, McVeigh woke early in his cell on Terre Haute's death row. The morning was quiet, the prison locked down as the hour approached with mechanical inevitability. At 5 a.m., guards offered him a final meal, but McVeigh requested only 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream, which he ate slowly, savoring each bite as if it were any ordinary day. He spent the morning alone, declining visits from family or his attorneys, though his legal team had met with him the day before to say their goodbyes. No spiritual advisors came. McVeigh had no use for them, no use for forgiveness or prayer or peace. Instead, he wrote a final statement, copying by hand the 1875 poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley, with its defiant lines, "I am the master of my fate, I am the captain of my soul." Even in death he refused to bend, refused to acknowledge the suffering he'd caused. At 7 a.m. Central Time, guards escorted McVeigh from his cell to the execution chamber, a small clinical room with a gurney and a one-way glass window for witnesses. He wore a khaki shirt and pants, his face pale but expressionless, empty of emotion. Strapped to the gurney, he was surrounded by a team of U.S. Marshals and prison officials who would oversee his final moments. The execution method was lethal injection, a 3-drug protocol designed to be humane, though how humane death can be for a mass murderer is a question without answer. Witnesses, 10 victims' family members, 10 media representatives, and 4 of McVeigh's chosen observers sat in silence behind the glass. Among them was Paul Howell, whose daughter Karen was killed in the bombing, who came to watch the man who murdered his child take his last breath. McVeigh made eye contact with the witnesses, his gaze steady, offering no apology, no acknowledgement of their pain. His last words were not spoken but written in the Invictus poem he handed to the warden. "I am the master of my fate." At 7:14 a.m., the first drug flowed. McVeigh's breathing slowed, his eyes fluttered shut, and his body went still. At 7:21 a.m., he was pronounced dead. The process was swift and clinical, over in minutes. The witnesses filed out, some in tears, others numb, unable to process that it was finally over. Outside the prison, a crowd had gathered, some cheering, others praying, as the nation absorbed the end of a dark chapter in American history. McVeigh's body was cremated, his ashes scattered in an undisclosed location to prevent the creation of a martyr's shrine, to ensure he would not be remembered as a hero by those who shared his twisted ideology. Timothy McVeigh's execution closed a wound but left scars that will never fully heal. His unrepentant stance, the scale of his crime, the 168 lives stolen, 19 of them children who never got to grow up, forces us to confront haunting questions about justice and vengeance, about evil and how it takes root in human hearts. The Oklahoma City bombing remains a wound in America's soul, a reminder that monsters don't always come from foreign lands. Sometimes they grow up in quiet neighborhoods, playing with other children, going to school, living ordinary lives until something inside them breaks, and they decide that their anger matters more than innocent lives. So, what do you think? Did the punishment fit the crime? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the haunting world of death row.